Isabella had always been a ghost, a memory long buried beneath the shadows of her father's criminal empire. Left behind after a bloody family feud, she had been presumed dead by everyone who once knew her. Her father, Victor Moretti, a ruthless mafia boss, didn't bother to search for her. In his world, the weak didn't survive, but Isabella wasn't weak. Years had passed since that night, the night when everything changed. She was just a child then, hiding in the corner of their estate, watching as her father's rivals stormed in, guns blazing. Her mother, screaming in terror, had been shot right before her eyes. Isabella had run, her small legs carrying her away from the chaos into the cold streets of the city, lost and forgotten. But time had a way of shaping people. The little girl who had been discarded by her father had grown up, stronger, colder, and more determined than ever. She had learned to survive on the streets, learned to fight, learned to kill. Now, Isabella wasn't just another forgotten soul. She was an assassin, feared by those who once crossed her family. She had spent years perfecting her skills, honing her craft, and now it was time to come back. It was time for revenge. Isabella's plan was clear: take down those who had betrayed her family one by one. She would dismantle her father's empire from the inside out, making sure he suffered as she had suffered. And when the time was right, she would reveal the truth to him: that his daughter, the one he had abandoned, was the one behind it all. Her first target was Antonio Russo, a close ally of her father and one of the men responsible for her mother's death. Antonio was a wealthy businessman now, using his position to mask his dirty dealings with the Mafia. He had risen to power by betraying those closest to him, and Isabella knew he would never see her coming. Disguised as a wealthy socialite, Isabella attended a high-profile gala hosted by Antonio. Her transformation was flawless. No one could recognize the girl she once was. She moved through the crowd with ease, her eyes always on Antonio. When the moment was right, she slipped away from the crowd and followed him into a secluded room. Antonio didn't even have time to react before she had a knife to his throat. His eyes widened in shock, but before he could speak, she leaned in close and whispered, "This is for my mother." With a swift motion, it was over. As she left the room, Isabella pulled out a small folded piece of paper from her pocket. She placed it carefully on Antonio's desk. The message was simple: the forgotten have returned. It was the first step in her plan and the beginning of her silent retribution. One by one, those who betrayed her would fall. And when her father realized what was happening, it would be too late. Isabella had risen from the ashes, and now no one could stop her. The morning after Antonio Russo's death, news spread like wildfire. A prominent businessman found murdered in his private office, throat slit, with no trace of the killer. The police were baffled, and the media speculated on every possible angle, except the truth. Only one person would know why Antonio had been targeted, but Victor Moretti remained silent. Victor, now older but still a powerful mafia figure, sat in his study reading the morning paper. His cold eyes scanned the report of Antonio's death, but there was no hint of surprise on his face. He had long expected enemies to come for his closest allies. This was the life he had chosen. But as he reached for his coffee, his hand froze. His eyes locked onto a single sentence in the article. A cryptic note was found at the scene, reading, "The forgotten have returned." Victor's heart skipped a beat. That phrase stirred something deep within him. His thoughts briefly wandered back to the past, to the night of the attack on his family. He remembered the chaos, the gunfire, the blood. His wife dead, his daughter dead. He had never confirmed Isabella's fate. He had never looked for her. Guilt flashed in his eyes for a moment, but Victor quickly buried it beneath his usual stoic mask. He dismissed the idea. Isabella was gone, and whoever this killer was had nothing to do with her. Isabella, however, knew better. She had spent years watching her father from the shadows, learning his moves, tracking his allies. She knew exactly how to unravel his empire. Antonio was only the first. There were others who had betrayed her family and helped her father rise to power. They all thought they were safe, protected by Victor's reach. But they hadn't expected Isabella to return, and they certainly didn't expect her to be their executioner. As Victor wrestled with the sudden resurgence of buried memories, Isabella was already preparing her next move. Her second target was Dominic Greco, a corrupt lawyer who had been instrumental in covering up her family's demise. He had ties to the Mafia that ran deeper than most, and his greed knew no limits. He had helped destroy her mother's legacy, profited from her father's crimes, and watched as Isabella's life was torn apart. Isabella knew that getting to Dominic wouldn't be as easy as slipping into a gala. He was paranoid, constantly surrounded by bodyguards and well fortified in his luxury estate. But years of practice had made her patient, methodical. She had observed his routine for weeks and knew exactly when he would be vulnerable. That night, Dominic was alone in his office, reviewing documents that tied him to yet another shady deal. He didn't hear Isabella enter the room, didn't see her until she was standing behind him, a gun pressed to his temple. "This is for my family," she whispered coldly before pulling the trigger. Like Antonio, Dominic Greco was dead. And like before, she left a note. "The forgotten have returned." The web of revenge was tightening around Victor Moretti, and soon he would know the full weight of what he had lost. Victor Moretti sat alone in his lavish estate, staring at the small slip of paper in his hand. "The forgotten have returned." Those words haunted him. Two of his closest associates, Antonio Russo and Dominic Greco, had been murdered in a matter of days, both with the same cryptic message left behind. It was no coincidence, and Victor knew it. His mind raced as he sifted through old memories, trying to make sense of this sudden vendetta against him. The note tugged at a piece of his past he had long buried, the night his family had been torn apart. He had survived the bloodshed and emerged stronger, more ruthless. But there was one loose end he had never tied. Isabella. Victor had always believed she was dead, lost in the chaos of that fateful night. After all, no one had ever found her body. Yet now, the message felt too personal, too deliberate. Could she have survived? Could it be Isabella behind these killings? The thought made his blood run cold, but he quickly dismissed it. No, it couldn't be. Isabella was gone. Whoever this killer was, they were someone else entirely, a ghost from his past with a grudge. Meanwhile, Isabella prepared for her next target. She had spent years training, perfecting her skills, all for this moment. Each kill brought her one step closer to the man who had abandoned her, the man who had built his empire on her family's suffering. But Isabella wasn't rushing her revenge. Every move was calculated, every strike precise. She wanted her father to feel the weight of each life lost, knowing that his power was slipping through his fingers. Her next target was Vincent Romano, a notorious arms dealer and one of her father's oldest allies. Vincent had played a key role in arming the men who had attacked her family. He was also fiercely loyal to Victor, always ready to defend him, no matter the cost. That made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. Isabella tracked Vincent to a high-end restaurant where he was dining with other powerful figures. The place was crawling with security, but Isabella had planned for that. She watched from a distance, waiting for her moment. When Vincent finally left the restaurant, surrounded by his bodyguards, Isabella followed them to a dark alley where their cars were parked. Using the shadows to her advantage, she struck swiftly, taking out the guards one by one before Vincent even realized what was happening. By the time he turned, Isabella was standing in front of him, her gun aimed at his chest. "Who are you?" Vincent demanded, fear creeping into his voice. Isabella stepped closer, her voice ice cold. "The forgotten." A single shot echoed through the alley, and Vincent Romano fell to the ground, lifeless. Isabella left another note behind, identical to the others. "The forgotten have returned." As news of Vincent's death reached Victor, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just any killer. This was personal. The ghosts of his past were coming for him, and there was nowhere left to hide. Victor Moretti's empire was crumbling before his eyes. With every phone call, he learned of yet another loyal ally being taken down, each accompanied by the same haunting message: "The forgotten have returned." The deaths were no accidents, and they were more than just murders. They were calculated strikes aimed at him. It was clear now that whoever was behind this had a personal vendetta. The thought that his daughter, Isabella, might be alive and orchestrating this wave of death was too much for him to bear, but the idea of Isabella surviving and now seeking revenge chipped away at his composure. He had convinced himself that she was gone, But the killings followed a pattern that only someone close to the family would know. Victor sat in his dimly lit study, looking at a photograph of a young Isabella. It was the last picture he had of her, before everything had gone wrong. She was smiling, innocent, unaware of the dark world she had been born into. He remembered the chaos of that night, the night when everything had fallen apart. In his thirst for power, he had made enemies. His enemies had retaliated, and his family had paid the price. Isabella had been just a child, caught in the crossfire. Victor had told himself that her death had been a necessary sacrifice in the brutal world he lived in. But now, if she were alive, it meant that everything he had built was at risk of being torn down by his own flesh and blood. The irony wasn't lost on him. In the midst of his turmoil, Victor knew one thing. If Isabella truly was alive and behind these killings, she would stop at nothing to destroy him. He had underestimated her once. He couldn't afford to do so again. Victor called a meeting with his remaining trusted men, the few who hadn't yet been picked off. They gathered in his estate, their faces grim and tense. "We need to find whoever's behind this," Victor said, pacing the room. "They know too much, and they're targeting the people closest to me." One of his men, Franco, a grizzled veteran of the underworld, spoke up. "Boss, this doesn't feel like any ordinary hitman. This is personal." Victor clenched his fists. He knew it was personal, but he couldn't admit to his men that it might be Isabella. That kind of weakness would shatter their confidence in him. Instead, he barked orders. "Franco, double security on everyone connected to me. Nobody moves without protection. I want eyes on anyone who might be a target." As the meeting ended, Victor was left alone with his thoughts. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anger. If Isabella truly had returned, she had grown into something far more dangerous than he ever anticipated. His phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen. "The forgotten will not be ignored." Victor's blood ran cold. She was coming for him, and he was running out of time. Isabella moved through the shadows, her movements precise and deliberate. Her latest target was a man named Lorenzo, one of her father's most trusted lieutenants. He had been one of the many who had stood by and done nothing when Victor's enemies had torn their family apart. Lorenzo had been responsible for tracking down potential threats to the Moretti family back in the day, but he had turned a blind eye to the violence that had engulfed them. Isabella would make sure he paid for his betrayal. Lorenzo lived in a heavily secured villa on the outskirts of the city. His men were well trained, but they weren't prepared for someone like Isabella. She had been planning this for weeks, studying their movements, analyzing the security systems, and finding weaknesses in their defenses. By the time she was ready to strike, she knew every inch of the property and every blind spot in the security cameras. Dressed in black, her face obscured by a mask, Isabella bypassed the main gate by scaling a nearby wall. She moved silently through the garden, avoiding the patrolling guards. Years of training as an assassin had honed her skills to perfection, and tonight she would put them to use once again. As she approached the villa, she saw Lorenzo sitting on the balcony, smoking a cigar, completely unaware of the danger that lurked in the darkness. Her heart raced as she recalled the day she had last seen him, standing next to her father, unmoved by the carnage around them. He had watched as her family had been torn apart, never lifting a finger to help. With a swift motion, Isabella pulled out a tranquilizer dart and took down the nearest guard without a sound. She approached the back entrance of the villa and swiftly disarmed the security system using a device she had created herself. It was a matter of seconds before she was inside. She moved silently through the house, making her way to the balcony where Lorenzo sat. As she approached, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of a glass door. The woman staring back at her was no longer the girl she had once been. She was a predator now, and Lorenzo was her prey. Lorenzo didn't hear her coming. He didn't even have time to turn around before she grabbed him from behind, clamping her hand over his mouth and pressing a knife to his throat. "Do you remember me?" she whispered, her voice cold and steady. Lorenzo's eyes widened in terror as he recognized her. He tried to struggle, but Isabella was too strong, too fast. She pressed the blade harder against his throat, drawing blood. "This is for my family," she said, her voice filled with fury. With one swift motion, she ended his life, leaving him slumped over in the chair. As she stood there, looking down at her latest victim, Isabella felt no remorse. The only thing that mattered was her mission. One by one, they would all pay. Before leaving, she left behind her usual message, scrawled in blood, "The forgotten will be remembered." With Lorenzo's death, Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. As she left the villa, she couldn't shake the weight of her past. The memories flooded back, her father's laughter, the warmth of family dinners, and the day everything shattered. Each kill was a step closer to her revenge, but it also unearthed ghosts she had tried to bury. Back at her hideout, a small, inconspicuous apartment in a rundown part of the city, Isabella meticulously cleaned her weapons and reviewed the photos of her remaining targets. Each one had played a role in the betrayal of the Moretti family. She had already taken out Lorenzo, and now she needed to focus on Marco, her father's right-hand man, who had abandoned them when the chaos erupted. Marco was a slippery man, always moving between different clubs and businesses. He was a man who thrived on deceit, and Isabella knew that tracking him would require cunning and patience. She spent hours researching his movements, combing through social media, and discreetly observing the clubs he frequented. Marco's life was filled with glamour and excess, and he had become a master at blending into the nightlife. After a week of surveillance, Isabella found her opportunity. Marco was set to attend a high-profile charity event at one of the city's most luxurious venues. It was the perfect place for her to make her move, crowded, chaotic, and dark enough to conceal her actions. She needed to get close to him without arousing suspicion. On the night of the event, Isabella transformed herself. She wore a mask to conceal her identity and blended seamlessly into the crowd of affluent guests. Her heart raced not with fear, but with anticipation. Tonight was another step in her quest for revenge. As she entered the venue, she surveyed the room, her eyes searching for Marco. She spotted him across the dance floor, surrounded by admirers, laughing and charming everyone around him. The sight of him made her stomach churn. How could he act so carefree when so many lives had been shattered because of his choices? Isabella made her way through the crowd, keeping her movements fluid and confident. She engaged in small talk with other guests, all while keeping Marco in her sight. As she approached him, she could feel her pulse quickening. This was it. She was finally going to confront him. "Marco," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness as she stepped close to him. He turned, a charming smile spreading across his face. "Ah, a beautiful stranger. What brings you here tonight?" he replied, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her mask. "You might say I'm here for a little unfinished business," she said, leaning in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. The moment his smile faltered, she knew she had him. Before he could react, she pulled out a small knife hidden in her clutch, the blade glinting under the dim lights. "It's time to pay for what you did." His eyes widened in shock as the reality of the situation sank in. The crowded room faded away, and all that mattered was the two of them in that moment. This was her revenge. This was her justice. As the tension mounted, she prepared to strike, ready to take another life and draw closer to the father who had left her behind. But in the back of her mind, a nagging thought lingered. How much longer could this path of vengeance continue? Would it ever bring her peace? The confrontation, Isabella stood poised, her knife glinting in the soft lighting of the charity event, and the room around her faded into silence. Marco's face shifted from shock to realization, and she could see the gears turning in his mind. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment she reveled in the power she held. The time for retribution had come, but she could sense the danger of letting emotion cloud her judgment. "What are you doing? You don't want to do this," Marco stammered, stepping back slightly. He tried to maintain his composure, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "You don't know what you're getting into." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm getting into," Isabella replied, her voice steady. "You left us to die. You were supposed to protect my family, and instead, you turned your back on us." The words felt heavy as they hung in the air between them. Marco was part of the betrayal, a critical player in the downfall of her family. She had spent years perfecting her skills for this moment, and now that it was here, she couldn't allow doubt to creep in. He was a coward hiding behind a facade of charm and wealth, and it was time to strip that away. "You were just a child," he protested, his voice rising. "You don't understand the choices we had to make. The Moretti family was crumbling. I did what I had to do, to survive. Survive? Isabella echoed, incredulous. You call abandoning your family survival? You're nothing but a coward, and tonight you'll pay for your betrayal. She stepped forward, brandishing the knife, ready to plunge it into his side. But just as she moved, a loud crash interrupted the moment. A group of people stumbled into the room, their laughter echoing as they swung open the door. Marco took advantage of the distraction and turned to flee, shoving through the crowd. As she raced after him, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. She couldn't let him escape, not after everything he had done. The crowd parted as she chased him through the venue, the laughter and music morphing into a chaotic blur. Marco darted toward the back exit, and she pushed herself to move faster, determination fueling her every step. She couldn't allow him to slip away. This was her chance to end the cycle of betrayal once and for all. As they reached the alley behind the venue, the cool night air rushed around them. Marco turned, panting, eyes wide with fear. Isabella, please, you don't have to do this. We can talk. But Isabella was done talking. You should have thought about that before you betrayed my family, she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. In a swift motion, she lunged forward, aiming the knife at him. Marco, cornered, attempted to dodge, but she was quicker. The blade grazed his arm, and he yelped in pain. Blood dripped down his skin, a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. You think this is a game? She spat. You ruined my life. He stumbled back, pressing his hand against the wound. Fear flashed in his eyes as he realized the gravity of the situation. Isabella, I never meant for it to go this far. No more excuses, she shouted, her voice echoing in the night. She lunged again, this time with purpose, and as the blade found its mark, Marco gasped, a look of shock crossing his face as he crumpled to the ground. Isabella stood over him, breathing heavily, the weight of her actions sinking in. She had finally avenged her family's betrayal, but in that moment a cold realization washed over her. Was this truly justice, or had she simply become a monster herself? As he lay bleeding on the ground, the finality of her actions settled like a heavy cloak around her shoulders. She had taken a life, and now she had to face the consequences, whatever they may be, stood over Marco's lifeless body, her heart pounding in her chest. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, weighing heavily on her conscience. She had avenged her family, but at what cost? The darkness she had embraced seemed to close in around her, and she felt an unfamiliar sense of emptiness. As she stepped back, the distant sounds of the city began to seep into her consciousness, sirens wailing, the hum of traffic, and the chatter of late-night revelers unaware of the tragedy that had just unfolded. Panic set in as she realized the risk of being caught. She had meticulously planned her revenge, but she hadn't prepared for the consequences of her actions. With her heart racing, Isabella turned to flee, but the weight of her thoughts kept her grounded for a moment. She had been alone for so long, fueled by anger and the desire for retribution. But now, as she looked down at Marco, the realization hit her. She had lost a part of herself in this quest for vengeance. Her mind racing, she needed to disappear, to leave the city that had been both her prison and her battleground. As she ran, memories of her childhood flooded her mind. The warmth of her family's love, the laughter they shared before betrayal shattered their lives. Isabella emerged onto the street, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't go home. She had no home to return to. Her father had turned his back on her, and the family she once loved had crumbled. The hunt for her father was still a burning ember in her heart, but now it was intertwined with the hope of finding peace. In that moment, Isabella decided she would no longer let the shadows of her past define her future. She would carry the weight of her actions as a reminder of who she had been. But she would also seek redemption. Perhaps she could help others who had suffered like she had, those left behind in the wake of betrayal. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know you're alive." Her heart raced. It was time to face her father, but this time it wouldn't be for revenge. It would be to confront the demons of her past and reclaim her life. As Isabella took a deep breath, she felt a sense of purpose igniting within her. No longer the lost daughter of a Mafia lord, she was now a woman ready to write her own story, one not defined by revenge, but by strength and resilience. With renewed determination, Isabella stood up and walked out of the cafe. ready to face whatever lay ahead, embracing the future she had once thought lost forever.